In this video we're going to be looking at the Siege of Jerusalem in 1099. Our only intention is to investigate the events of the Siege of Jerusalem. Success criteria will be to identify key features of the siege, to practice writing in full sentences, and to predict the aftermath of the siege. So, as a quick recap, what I want you to do is give me 3 different causes of or reasons why people went on the First Crusade. So that could be to do with anything that's happened in the last few lessons that would lead to people joining the First Crusade. So I want you to pause the video here, add your 3 different reasons or causes, and then press play when you're ready to move on. So, this is the area we've been looking at the last few lessons. You can see the red dots are where the Crusaders have come from. So you've got Godfrey at the top, Raymond in Toulose, and Raymond from down in southern Italy. Now on the right you can see Constantinople, which is where we spent a lot of the early part of our lessons. And then the Crusaders have now worked their way through, and then we got last week as far as the city of Antioch. So today we're going to be focusing on this region down here, which is the Holy Land. So you can see there's the zoom in of the area of the Holy Land we're looking at. You can see Antioch towards the north there, which is where we left off, and Jerusalem a little bit further south, which is where our crusade is heading. So this is the timeline of when we've been looking at. We've got the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, Battle of Hastings there in 1066 as reference point. We had the Council of Clermont later on, Siege of Antioch, and now the Siege of Jerusalem in 1099. This is a map of Jerusalem from back in the 11th century. It was well protected with walls going around the outside, as you can see, which we'll come to discuss in a little while. So, when the Crusaders reached Jerusalem, they started their siege and they split their forces. So, Duke Godfrey besieged the city from the north side, so towards the north side near St. Stephen's Gate, and then Count Raymond of Toulose and his army were in the southwest near the Zion Gate at the foot of Mount Zion. So we've got a split siege. Defenders are defending on 2 sides. However, the walls were very strongly defended and too high to get over without ladders. The Crusaders didn't have enough wood to make new ladders, so without the wood they're not going to make the ladders, they can't get over the walls. The situation grew worse because all of the wells in the nearby area had been poisoned and clean water was miles away. So the people of Jerusalem knew that the Crusaders were coming. They poisoned the wells in advance, which meant that the siege was that much more difficult for the Crusaders because they were having to travel a long way to get their water. The situation grew even more desperate as food supplies ran low and the Europeans suffered in the heat and dust of the desert. So much like the Siege of Antioch, food supplies are starting to run low. Not only that, but because the Jerusalem is in quite a very hot climate, in deserty climate, it's going to be very, very difficult for soldiers to keep up a siege, especially when wearing armour. Then the local Muslim forces, who the Crusaders called the Saracens, launched surprise attacks. So whilst they're doing this, whilst they're putting up with the lack of food and water and the heat, the Saracens, the Muslim forces, are repeatedly launching surprise attacks. The Crusaders then needed some sort of breakthrough to get into the city. They needed something to happen, else they were just going to fail miserably. That breakthrough came when a hidden supply of wood was discovered. Many Crusaders believed that this was the result of divine help and that God was on their side. So a little like in the Siege of Antioch when they discovered the Holy Lance, this is another case of the Crusaders believing in divine intervention from God and God being on their side. This would help them build a battering ram. So a battering ram is what you use to knock down gates. several ladders, and 2 large siege towers. So siege tower is what you can see in the image there on the right, where it's a large tower which you can climb and be protected rather than just climbing up a ladder. These towers were covered in animal skins and branches to protect the people inside. The Crusaders could then climb up the tower and attempt to fight the Saracens on top of the walls. So they're finally getting to the point where they can make some sort of attempt to breach the city. With the siege towers and battering rams, the fighting for Jerusalem became even more brutal and desperate. At one point, the Crusaders captured an Egyptian spy and catapulted him over the walls back into Jerusalem. So the Crusaders are quite gruesome, they're quite grim. They're not taking any prisoners, they are literally catapulting people into the city. The Saracens reportedly responded by spitting on crosses. So this is likely to anger the Crusaders because, as we know, the whole central argument and reason why a lot of them had gone on this crusade was to fight for God. So this spitting on crosses is going to anger and wind up the Crusaders. The Crusaders, however, could still not get the towers close enough to get into the city. So they're getting closer, but still not succeeding. This is an extract from Count Raymond of Toulose, who was one of the leaders of the siege. He said, "The Bishop Adamar appeared before her, saying, 'You who have come from distant lands to worship God, let each one turn from his evil ways. Then, with bare feet, march around Jerusalem, praising God. If you do this, and then make a great attack on the city on the 9th day, it will be captured.'" Right, I want you to pause the video here for a minute, and I want you to just very quickly answer this question. So based on this source, what is Raymond saying his men need to do in order to win the battle? So what do you think he is suggesting that his men do to win the battle? Pause the video, and then press play when you're ready to move on, and I'll explain what Raymond's saying here. So hopefully you've answered that question now. Looking at this source then, Raymond is suggesting to his men that in order to win the battle for Jerusalem, then they need to march around Jerusalem praising God. They need to literally walk around the city praying and praising God. It's also suggesting that on the 9th day they will be successful. So that's exactly what the Crusaders did. Count Raymond asked them to march around the city holding crosses and relics praising God, and they did just that. The fighting continued, and on 13th of July 1099, Godfrey made the key breakthrough. He noticed a section of the wall which was less defended than others and would be easier for his tower to attack. At night he moved the tower over a mile to this part of the city walls. The next morning they attacked, and the fighting became more and more intense. Stones, wood, even fire was thrown at the Crusaders, but they fought on. Eventually, a flaming arrow shot from the tower started a fire among the Saracens who fled. There was an opening, and the soldiers rushed out of the tower, over the walls, and into the city. So finally, they have breached into the city walls, and they've got into Jerusalem. Now, this is going to suggest to them again that they have been successful because of God being on their side. So, just in the siege of Antioch, when the Holy Lance gave them influence and inspiration to keep going, the marching around the city praising God has now given them inspiration, and they're going to see that as a reason for success. Once inside, the Crusaders began a shocking slaughter of the inhabitants, so the people within the city, killing around 30,000. According to Count Raymond of Toulose, "Some of our men cut off the heads of their enemies, others shot them with arrows, so they fell from the towers. But these were small matters compared to what happened at the Temple of Solomon. What happened there? If I tell the truth, you will hardly believe. In the Temple of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees. The city was filled with corpses and blood." So even Raymond of Toulose is saying how ruthless the Crusaders are being when they have breached the city, what they're doing to the Saracens. A different account, known as the Gesta Francorum, says this of the Temple of Solomon attack. Our men followed, killing even to the temple of Solomon, where the slaughter was so great that our men waded in blood up to their ankles. They also ordered all the Saracen dead to be cast outside because of the great stench, since the whole city was filled with their corpses. And so the living Saracens dragged the dead before the exits of the gates, and arranged them in heaps as if they were houses. No one ever saw or heard of such slaughter of pagan people. No one knows their number except God alone. So this source is saying that these Christians have murdered the Muslims in a scale not seen before. So even when Christians were murdering pagans, so people who believe in lots of different gods, it was nothing like what happened within the city of Jerusalem during that first siege. So that is the story of the siege of Jerusalem. Obviously, this resulted in the Christians recapturing the city in the name of God. So, what you're going to do is we are going to practice today writing in full sentences. So we're going to be using the information from the video and the PowerPoint, so you're welcome to go back through to find the answers. I'm not particularly worried about you knowing the answers off by heart on your own. Today we're more practicing how to formulate our answers, so you are free to go back and find answers within the text. For this first slide, I have given you the stem of the sentence answers. So I've given you the starter. So for each question, I just want you to find the answer and complete the sentence. So you've written out a complete sentence. So for example, the example question I gave was which count led the siege on Jerusalem in 1099? And the answer in a full sentence would be the count who led the siege on Jerusalem in 1099 was Raymond of Toulose. So I've given a nice full answer. What I want you to do is pause the video here and complete those 3 sentences. When you are done, press play and you can move on to this next part of the task. In this second part to the activity, you have got the end of the sentences. So I've given you the answers this time. What you're going to do now is you are going to complete the full sentence by this time putting in the sentence starter. So you need to link it back to the question. So again, you can look back at the examples from the last slide and the example on this one. Question example: in which year did the siege of Jerusalem take place? The answer would be the siege of Jerusalem took place in the year 1099. So I'm referring back to the question within my answer. So again, have a go at those 3 sentences, complete the 3 sentences, and then press play when you're ready to move on to the final section of today's lesson. So, this time on our final section, I have given you 3 questions, and this time I want you to complete the answers in full sentences on your own. So I've given you no parts of the questions. So there are 3 questions there that I would like you to answer. Again, you are welcome to look back at the text and in the video to find the actual answer, but I want you to practice putting it into a full sentence. So linking it back to the question within your answer. If you've done that and you still have some time remaining, I have set a couple of extension challenge tasks, which are longer, more explanation related answer questions. Which is question 1, explain why many crusaders would believe they won because of God. I want you to make sure you're using evidence to back yourself up on that one. And question 2, predict what you think the reaction of the Muslims might have been after the fall of Jerusalem. So after all of that fighting and what happened to their people within the city, how are other Muslims going to react, do you think? Make sure you're explaining your reasoning why. So that is today's lesson. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon.